For 7 centuries, the heavy infantry of Rome dictated the borders of the known world, projecting martial authority from the dense forests of Britannia to the coastlines of the Mediterranean. Yet, whenever the legions marched eastward into the arid expanses of Syria and Mesopotamia between 53 BC and 636 AD, their rigid tactical discipline was repeatedly turned into a fatal vulnerability. The desert did not just defeat Roman armies, it dismantled the very foundation of their military doctrine. The baking heat of the relentless eastern sun, radiating through 40 pounds of iron armor, stripped away the endurance of the world's finest close-quarters fighters before the enemy even struck. This is the history of 3 catastrophic campaigns, spanning the Republic, the High Empire, and late antiquity, where Roman commanders fundamentally misunderstood the environment and their adversaries. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, a triumvir's political vanity fed 20,000 legionaries to a barrage of endless arrows. 3 centuries later, at Edessa in 260 AD, logistical collapse and dehydration allowed a Sassanid king to capture a sitting Roman emperor alive, turning the living embodiment of the state into a human footstool. Finally, at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD, blinding dust and brilliant cavalry envelopments erased the last great army of antiquity in a single afternoon, stripping the Levant from Roman control forever. Welcome back to World Chronicles. In this comprehensive historical supercut, we will break down the tactical rigidity, the lethal environmental pressure, and the catastrophic command failures that turned 3 massive Roman expeditions into complete annihilation. But to understand how Rome's aura of invincibility was first shattered, we must go back to 53 BC. To understand why a man of 60, possessing a fortune vast enough to buy kingdoms, would drag himself into the hostile terrain of Syria, one must look at the bruised ego of Marcus Licinius Crassus. Rome in 53 BC was governed by the first triumvirate, a delicate and uneasy alliance of colossal ambition. Pompey the Great had successfully redrawn the maps of the East, while Julius Caesar was systematically carving his name into history with the blood of the Gauls. Crassus was the financier, the man who had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus decades prior. Yet in the ruthless currency of the Republic, old victories bought no silence. He sat at the table of power, but felt entirely overshadowed by generals. In the eyes of the Senate, gold commanded envy, but only military triumph commanded auctoritas, true and unassailable authority. Parthia posed no imminent threat to Roman security. This campaign was a war of vanity, manufactured entirely by a politician terrified of being forgotten. This invasion was so transparently unjust and strategically unnecessary that it sickened even the war-hardened Roman populace. As Crassus prepared to march, the tribune of the plebs, Aetius Capito, stood at the gates of the city, lighting a brazier of incense and screaming ancient, terrible curses to witness the impiety of the expedition. Ignoring the political uproar, Crassus assembled a juggernaut of roughly 40,000 men. The vast majority of this force consisted of heavy legionary infantry, the finest close-quarters fighters the Mediterranean world had ever produced. They were a slow, methodical war machine designed to crush enemy formations through disciplined, forward momentum. When Crassus arrived in the east, a moment of strategic sanity briefly presented itself. King Artavasdes II of Armenia, a longtime Roman ally, rode into the camp offering a massive reinforcement of nearly 50,000 troops, effectively doubling the Roman fighting power. The Armenian monarch attached one logical condition. The Roman army had to march north through the rugged mountains of Armenia. In those steep highlands and narrow passes, the lethal mobility of the Parthian cavalry would be physically nullified, allowing the Roman heavy infantry to dictate the terms of engagement. It was a defensively sound strategy that ensured secure supply lines through friendly territory. Crassus, driven by impatience and the dangerous arrogance of a man who believed his wealth could bypass basic logistics, flatly rejected the proposal. He had no desire to undertake a slow, grinding campaign in the mountains. He wanted a straight, rapid line of advance directly to the Parthian capital of Seleucia. To guide his massive column through the unfamiliar terrain, Crassus placed his absolute trust in an Arab chieftain named Ariamnes. Ariamnes had previously served Pompey and wore the convincing mask of a Roman ally, but his loyalty had long since been purchased by Parthian gold. Utilizing a sharp tongue and psychological manipulation, Ariamnes goaded Crassus, mocking the sluggish pace of the heavy infantry and asking if the Romans intended to build a new city in the sand rather than conquer one. He successfully urged the command staff to turn away from the life-giving, secure supply line of the Euphrates River, leading the army deeper into the vast open wasteland of Mesopotamia. As the legions marched inward, the landscape fundamentally shifted. The fertile soil gave way to an endless ocean of baked earth, devoid of trees for shade, streams for water, or hills for tactical cover. Thirst began to gnaw at the legendary discipline of the ranks as the men marched with parched throats into a shimmering heat haze that stretched endlessly across the flat horizon. The environment itself became an active enemy weapon, hammering down on men wearing 40 pounds of iron armor and turning their protection into suffocating ovens. By the time Ariamnes vanished into the night to report to his true masters, the trap had already snapped shut. The Roman army was adrift in a sea of sand, exposed, exhausted, and strategically blind. As the shimmering heat haze near the town of Carrhae finally parted, the Roman army halted its march, confronted by an enemy that initially appeared underwhelming. Fearing a sudden envelopment by light cavalry in the open desert, Crassus immediately abandoned standard linear deployment and ordered his forces to form a massive hollow square. This defensive formation was a fortress of flesh and iron, with lines 12 men deep facing outward in every direction. It was theoretically impenetrable, designed to absorb the kinetic shock of a cavalry charge and repel attacks from any flank. However, this dense geometric structure possessed a fatal inherent flaw. It was completely static. It traded strategic mobility for absolute, localized security, effectively turning the Roman expeditionary force into a sprawling, immovable target. Facing this wall of Roman steel was the Parthian general Syria, a brilliant tactician who recognized immediately that engaging the legions in a contest of brute infantry strength would mean suicide. Instead, he brought a highly specialized, asymmetrical force of only 10,000 horsemen, outnumbered 4-1 by the Romans. The composition of this army was engineered specifically to dismantle the advantages of heavy infantry. 9,000 of these riders were light horse archers, possessing the ability to strike from a distance and retreat far faster than heavily armored men could run. The remaining 1,000 were cataphracts, riders, and mounts, entirely encased in heavy scale mail. They served a crucial psychological and tactical purpose, looming on the horizon as a constant, lethal threat, ensuring that if the Roman square ever broke formation to chase the archers, the heavy lancers would instantly ride down the fractured infantry lines. Yet, Syria's true genius lay not in his cavalry maneuvers, but in his mastery of battlefield logistics. In standard ancient warfare, the effectiveness of missile troops was governed by a strict mathematical limit: the physical capacity of a quiver. Roman military doctrine was built around this reality. Legionaries were trained to lock their shields, endure the initial storm of projectiles, wait for the enemy to exhaust their ammunition, and then advance to crush the depleted skirmishers. Syria systematically broke this fundamental rule of engagement. Hidden safely behind his combat lines, he had assembled a dedicated supply train of 1,000 camels. These pack animals carried no water or food. They were loaded exclusively with massive crates of spare arrows. By establishing a continuous relay system between his firing line and his supply train, Sharinna decoupled his archers from their ammunition limits, creating a relentless assembly line of ranged lethality. The engagement opened with a sensory shock that would haunt the surviving veterans for decades. A concussive, deafening thrum of thousands of composite bows released simultaneously, followed immediately by the sickening sound of heavy iron tips punching through wood, leather, and flesh. The Parthian composite bow, laminated from wood, horn, and sinew, generated a kinetic velocity that entirely defied Roman battlefield experience. The arrows did not merely glance off the heavy Roman shields. They hammered into the curved scudo with the force of javelins, frequently penetrating deep enough to nail the legionaries' hands directly to their own defensive equipment, or piercing through mail shirts to pin men's feet to the scorching sand. Desperate to mitigate the catastrophic casualty rate, the Roman officers ordered the ranks to contract into the famous testudo, or tortoise formation. By overlapping their shields to create a solid roof and wall of wood, the legions had historically neutralized the light bows of European tribal forces. But against the high-velocity, armor-piercing capabilities of the Parthian weapons, the dense packing of the testudo became a fatal liability. The formation required men to stand shoulder to shoulder, severely restricting their physical movement. When an arrow found its mark, the wounded soldier could not fall or retreat without compromising the integrity of the shield wall, forcing the ranks to shuffle awkwardly as they bled out. The Romans were effectively trapped in a stifling, suffocating cage of their own making, unable to break formation without exposing themselves to the waiting cataphracts, and unable to close the distance to utilize their short swords. Throughout the agonizing hours under the harsh Mesopotamian sun, Crassus and his senior commanders clung desperately to the core tenet of their tactical training. They believed eventually the enemy must run dry. They watched the waves of Parthian riders sweep forward, loose their devastating volleys, and wheel away into the dust. But the barrage never slackened. A wave of profound psychological terror rippled through the Roman command structure when they finally realized the mechanism of their destruction. The Parthian horsemen were not falling back to rest. They were cycling to the rear to rendezvous with the camel train, rapidly exchanging empty quivers for full ones before returning to the firing line. The Romans were not fighting a conventional battle. They were standing completely paralyzed before an execution squad that had brought enough ammunition to kill every single man on the field. To alleviate the relentless pressure on the main infantry square, Crassus authorized a highly aggressive, localized breakout. He ordered his son, Publius Crassus, a decorated cavalry officer who had served with distinction under Julius Caesar in Gaul, to lead a detachment forward. Publius mobilized a strike force consisting of 1,300 elite Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and 8 cohorts of heavy infantry, driving them directly into the Parthian lines. For a brief moment, the tactic appeared to succeed. The Parthian horse archers broke contact and executed a rapid withdrawal into the desert haze. Mistaking this disciplined tactical retreat for a genuine rout, the younger Crassus pushed his detachment forward, advancing miles away from the logistical and defensive anchor of the main Roman army. It was a fatal misreading of Eastern cavalry doctrine. Once the Roman detachment was completely isolated from reinforcement, the Parthians halted their retreat and turned to engage. From the swirling dust emerged the Parthian cataphracts. These heavy lancers, encased entirely in scale armor, functioned as the shock troops of Surena's host. The light Gallic cavalry, trained for the fluid, skirmishing warfare of tribal Europe, found their weapons entirely ineffective against the ironclad riders and mounts. Despite fighting with suicidal bravery, some Gauls reportedly leaping from their saddles to wrestle the long Parthian lances or thrusting daggers into the unprotected bellies of the enemy horses. Courage could not overcome the sheer kinetic mass of armored heavy cavalry. The Roman detachment was systematically pinned against a sand dune and dismantled. Unwilling to be paraded as a living captive in a foreign court, Publius ordered his own shield-bearer to drive a sword through his side. The destruction of the breakout force was rapidly converted into a weapon of psychological warfare. When the Parthian cavalry returned to the main Roman perimeter, they did not bring the expected relief of a broken siege. They brought a long spear, and mounted upon its tip was the severed head of Publius Crassus. The sight of the young commander's remains, held high above the dust, shattered the last vestiges of Roman morale. As the Parthian commander Chronicles rode close enough to hurl calculated taunts regarding Crassus's ancestry, the rigid discipline that had sustained the legions throughout the day finally began to evaporate. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the Parthians withdrew, adhering to their strict doctrine of never fighting or camping near enemy infantry at night to avoid disorganized ambushes. The darkness brought an end to the arrows, but it ushered in a profound operational paralysis. Inside the Roman camp, the standard military protocols dissolved. No watchfires were lit, no rations were distributed, and no defensive sentries were posted. In the command tent, Marcus Licinius Crassus wrapped his cloak around his head and collapsed onto the ground, rendered entirely catatonic by the death of his son and the staggering scale of his tactical failure. Realizing that the supreme commander was no longer functioning, his lieutenants, Cassius Longinus and Octavius, assumed control and issued the order to retreat immediately toward the walled town of Carrhae under the cover of night. But this required a brutal calculus of speed over survival. A chilling silence fell over the dark encampment, broken only by the panicked screams and groans of 4,000 severely wounded legionaries who realized they were being abandoned to the enemy. Their desperate cries echoed across the flat desert, alerting the Parthians to the withdrawal. Yet the cavalry simply waited for dawn before riding into the camp and methodically cutting the throats of all 4,000 men left behind. The withdrawal rapidly devolved from an organized maneuver into a fragmented death march. The surviving Romans scrambled toward the hill country near Seneca, desperate to reach rugged terrain that would finally neutralize the mobility of the Parthian horsemen. Chronicles, recognizing that an uphill assault against entrenched heavy infantry would incur unacceptable casualties, opted for diplomatic manipulation. He rode out with his bow unstrung, offering a parley and claiming that the King of Kings desired a peace treaty. Crassus, a veteran of Roman political treachery, instantly recognized the offer as a trap and refused to engage. However, his soldiers, broken by profound dehydration and the trauma of the previous days, mutinied. Clashing their weapons against their shields, the legionaries threatened their own commander, forcing the wealthiest man in Rome to walk down the hill as a hostage to his own army's terror. The parley was a carefully orchestrated execution. The Parthians offered Crassus a horse with a golden bit, but as soon as he mounted, the grooms began whipping the animal to force it away from the Roman staff. Recognizing the abduction attempt, Octavius drew his sword, triggering a desperate, confused melee in the dust. Octavius was cut down, and in the ensuing chaos, a Parthian soldier named Pomaxatharus killed the triumvir. Without leadership, the remaining Roman forces either surrendered or scattered, only to be hunted down relentlessly. Of the 40,000 legionaries who had crossed the Euphrates, 20,000 were left dead in the sand, 10,000 were captured and marched to the eastern frontiers of the Parthian Empire, and barely 10,000 managed to escape back to Syria. while later legends claimed the Parthians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat to mock his insatiable greed. The historical reality was far more damaging than poetic justice. The total annihilation of the expedition fundamentally altered the geopolitical axis of the ancient world. The Parthians captured 7 Aquilae, the sacred golden eagles of the legions, inflicting a national humiliation that would fester in the Roman psyche for decades. More critically, the death of Crassus destabilized the highest echelons of the Republic. As the financial buffer between the colossal military egos of Caesar and Pompey, his absence collapsed the first triumvirate, directly paving the road to the catastrophic civil war that would permanently destroy the Roman Republic. The Parthians had humiliated Rome, but 3 centuries later, another ruler would march his legions into the east, walking blindly into a trap that would tear the empire itself in two. 300 years after Crassus's expedition dissolved in the Mesopotamian sands, the geopolitical reality of the East had fundamentally transformed, and the Roman Empire itself was fighting for its very survival. By 260 AD, the absolute dominance of the Pax Romana was a distant memory. Rome was actively tearing itself apart in what historians recognize as the crisis of the 3rd century. The imperial economy was crippled by severe currency debasement and hyperinflation, eroding the financial foundation necessary to maintain the legions. Furthermore, the political structure was inherently unstable, caught in an endless, violent cycle of civil wars and barracks, emperors who seized and lost power by the sword. Yet the greatest threat to Roman stability was not internal factionalism, but the emergence of a new, highly centralized superpower across the Euphrates. The decentralized semi-feudal Parthian dynasty had been violently overthrown and replaced by the Sassanid Persian Empire. Under the command of the aggressive and expansionist King of Kings, Shapur I, this new Persian state possessed a highly organized, professionalized military apparatus driven by centralized royal authority. The Sassanids deployed heavy cataphract cavalry and skilled siege engineers, deliberately intending to push their imperial borders westward and reclaim the ancient territories of the Achaemenid Empire. In 259 and early 260 AD, Shapur I launched a massive invasion into Roman Mesopotamia, successfully laying siege to the heavily fortified, vital frontier city of Edessa. The loss of this critical strategic anchor would effectively fracture the defensive line of the east, opening the wealthy provinces of Syria and Anatolia to unchecked Sassanid raids. To answer this existential threat, the Roman Emperor Valerian was forced to mobilize the Central Imperial Field Army. Unlike Crassus, Valerian was not an insecure politician chasing vanity. He was an aging, pragmatic administrator trying desperately to hold a crumbling world together. He stripped garrisons from across the empire, assembling a massive force of approximately 70,000 troops to march toward the frontier. However, while this army appeared as an unstoppable juggernaut on paper, in reality, it was already dying from within. The Roman world was simultaneously being ravaged by the plague of Cyprian, a devastating viral pandemic that severely degraded population centers, disrupted agricultural supply chains, and crippled military logistics. As Valerian drove his massive columns eastward toward the Syrian desert, the sheer density of the marching formations turned the expedition into a mobile incubator for the pathogen. The stifling air inside the tightly packed Roman marching camps grew heavy and thick, with the rancid smell of fever and dysentery, as the invisible disease systematically hollowed out the strength of the veteran heavy infantry. Men who had trained their entire lives to lock shields and hold the line against heavy cavalry were instead dying by the thousands in their tents, entirely unable to lift their weapons. The logistical strain of supplying 70,000 men and their thousands of draft animals in an arid environment was already immense, but the rapid spread of the contagion forced the Roman command structure into a state of operational panic. The army was consuming its rations while losing its combat effectiveness every single day it remained on the march. Valerian's strategic judgment, clouded by the immediate necessity of saving Edessa and stopping the internal hemorrhage of his own forces, began to severely compromise. He could not afford a slow, methodical campaign of maneuver or a defensive standoff, while his army literally dissolved from sickness. He needed a decisive, rapid-pitched battle to break the Sassanid siege, resupply his starving and diseased men behind the secure walls of Edessa, and restore the deterrence of the imperial frontiers. But Sassanid intelligence networks had meticulously tracked the slow, agonizing progress of the diseased Roman columns. Shapur, I fully understood the degraded physical and psychological state of the approaching legions. Exhausted, heavily attrited by the plague, and desperate for the safety of the fortress walls, the Roman army finally reached the arid plains of Edessa to break the siege, completely unaware that Shapur I was not waiting for a battle. He was waiting to drop the net. As the vanguard of the imperial field army approached the environs of Edessa, Emperor Valerian prepared to deploy his surviving heavy infantry into traditional battle lines. He anticipated a conventional clash, believing that the sheer weight of Roman arms could punch through the siege lines and relieve the beleaguered garrison. However, King Shapur I possessed a highly centralized, professional military apparatus that did not adhere to the static warfare doctrines of the Mediterranean. Instead of massing his forces to meet the Roman advance head-on, the Sassanid monarch utilized the superior strategic mobility of his cavalry to execute a massive, sweeping envelopment. Sassanid light horsemen and heavily armored cataphracts bypassed the Roman vanguard entirely, flowing rapidly around the flanks of the marching columns. Before the imperial command staff could fully comprehend the shifting geometry of the battlefield, the Persian forces severed the Roman lines of communication back to the province of Syria. More critically, Shapur's cavalry secured the high ground and systematically blocked all access to the local river networks and freshwater springs. Valerian's army was entirely surrounded on the open, arid plains, geographically locked in a pocket of baked earth. For the Roman heavy infantry, this envelopment was a death sentence. A force of nearly 70,000 men requires tens of thousands of gallons of water daily simply to survive, let alone engage in high-intensity combat. The metallic taste of dust and profound dehydration settled over the encampment as the encircled legions stared at lines of Sassanid cavalry blocking every route to the river. Shapur deliberately refused to order a direct assault. He understood that a cornered Roman legion remained a lethal entity in close-quarters combat. Instead, he relied on the environment to dismantle his enemy. He utilized his horse archers to maintain a continuous, harassing perimeter, forcing the Romans to hold their tight, defensive formations under the punishing heat without the relief of engagement. The combination of extreme dehydration, thermal exhaustion, and the ongoing ravages of the Cyprian plague rapidly degraded the operational cohesion of the imperial army. Men physically lacked the muscular endurance to hold their heavy scuda shields or maintain their marching ranks. The rigid discipline of the cohorts dissolved into a desperate, localized struggle for survival as the command structure broke down. Valerian recognized that his army was days away from total biological collapse. They were dying without the opportunity to strike a single decisive blow against the Sassanid main host. Driven by the absolute necessity of securing water and a safe withdrawal, the Roman emperor sought to open diplomatic channels. Valerian offered a massive ransom, promising exorbitant payments in gold bullion if Shapur would allow the imperial army to retreat safely back across the Euphrates. The Sassanid king feigned interest in the financial settlement and agreed to a formal parley between the two sovereigns. Accompanied by a small retinue of senior officers and Praetorian guards, Valerian rode out from the defensive perimeter to negotiate the terms of surrender personally. It was a fatal miscalculation rooted in an outdated Roman worldview, which often treated Eastern monarchs as regional chieftains easily managed or bought off with imperial coin. Shapur viewed himself as the king of kings, the ruler of a peer superpower, and he possessed absolutely no intention of honoring Roman diplomatic immunity. The moment the Roman delegation distanced itself from the main army, Sassanid heavy cavalry closed the trap. Valerian and his entire command staff were physically seized and disarmed in the field. The geopolitical and psychological magnitude of this single action was unprecedented in Roman history. For over 7 centuries, the Republic and the Empire had suffered catastrophic military defeats, lost entire legions in foreign forests, and seen commanders killed in action, but in Augustus, the supreme commander, the high priest, and the living, semi-divine embodiment of the Roman state had never been captured alive by a foreign adversary. The imperial aura of invincibility was irrevocably shattered in the dust of Edessa. Witnessing the capture of their emperor and lacking any cohesive leadership, the starving, diseased remnants of the Roman field army capitulated entirely. The 70,000 men were not granted a swift death in battle. Instead, Shapur engaged in a massive, pragmatic harvesting of human capital. The surviving legionaries, particularly the combat engineers and architectural specialists, were marched in chains deep into the Sassanid heartland. They were enslaved and permanently integrated into the Persian state infrastructure, forced to construct bridges, roads, and massive irrigation systems for their conquerors. The most famous monument to this humiliation remains the Bandi Kaisar, or Caesar's Dam, at Shushtar in modern-day Iran, a massive feat of hydraulic engineering built entirely by the forced labor of Valerian's captured army. While Valerian spent his final days serving as a human stepping stool for a foreign king, the shockwave of his capture triggered a geopolitical collapse that fractured the Roman world. For the central government in Rome, the destruction of a 70,000-strong field army was a logistical disaster. The capture of the Augustus was an ideological catastrophe. The Sassanids immortalized this humiliation, carving massive stone reliefs at Naqsh Rostam that permanently depicted a mounted Shapur grasping the wrist of the captive Roman emperor. This visual propaganda broadcasted to the known world that the fundamental social contract of the empire, the belief that the emperor possessed the divine favor and martial authority to protect the frontiers, was utterly invalidated. Deprived of its primary military deterrent, the imperial defensive network buckled. Northern tribal confederations, recognizing the sudden paralysis of the Roman military apparatus, immediately intensified their incursions across the Rhine and Danube rivers. Under this unbearable strategic strain, the physical map of the Roman world violently fractured into 3 distinct, competing entities. In the west, the provincial governors and remaining legions realized that the central government in Italy could no longer provide reinforcements or reliable funding. Consequently, the provinces of Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania seceded to form the independent Gallic Empire under the military commander Postumus. This breakaway state was not an act of anti-Roman rebellion, but a desperate, localized administrative mechanism to maintain Roman military order and defend the Rhine frontier without waiting for orders from a paralyzed capital. Simultaneously in the east, the massive power vacuum created by the annihilation of Valerian's legions was filled by the wealthy oasis city of Palmyra, initially acting as a loyal proxy state to halt further Sassanid advances into the Levant. The Palmyrene leadership under Odenathus, and later the highly ambitious Queen Zenobia, systematically absorbed the Roman provinces of Syria, Palestine, and eventually Egypt. By commandeering these territories, Palmyra effectively sequestered the richest agricultural and commercial assets of the eastern Mediterranean. By the late 260s AD, the legitimate Roman emperor controlled merely the central Mediterranean and the Balkans, suffocating under severe hyperinflation after being entirely stripped of the vast grain shipments of the Nile and the vital silver mines of the West. Yet, the profound difference between the Roman Empire and the empires of the ancient Near East was its deeply ingrained institutional resilience. Where earlier centralized states often collapsed entirely following the capture or flight of a single sovereign, the Roman administrative and military machine refused to die. The crisis catalyzed a brutal, necessary evolution within the Roman high command, leading to the ascension of hardened, pragmatic military officers from the Illyrian provinces. By 274 AD, the Emperor Aurelian, utilizing rapid forced marches and newly reformed cavalry detachments, waged a series of grueling, high-speed campaigns to forcibly reintegrate both the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway states. Earning the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, Aurelian stitched the fractured imperial map back together through sheer military force and relentless discipline. The catastrophe of Edessa had forced the Roman state to the very brink of extinction, proving once again that the traditional doctrines of Mediterranean heavy infantry were highly vulnerable to the logistical exhaustion and fluid encirclement tactics of the eastern deserts. Rome would eventually rebuild its walls, reform its currency, and reclaim its imperial pride. But the deadliest desert trap in military history was still waiting 4 centuries in the future, ready to erase antiquity forever. By the early 7th century, the Roman Empire, now the Byzantine Empire ruled from Constantinople, had just survived a grueling 26-year total war against its ancient rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire. Emperor Heraclius had miraculously snatched victory from the jaws of defeat in 628 AD, restoring imperial control over the eastern provinces. But the victory was entirely Pyrrhic. The imperial treasury was effectively bankrupt. The agricultural base of the Levant was economically devastated, and the veteran field armies were heavily depleted. To stabilize the state's shattered finances, the Byzantine administration made a fatal fiscal decision. They abruptly cut the traditional subsidy payments to the allied Arab tribes that patrolled the southern desert frontiers. This single administrative action dismantled the empire's early warning system just as an unprecedented storm was gathering in the south. In this state of profound physical and financial exhaustion, the Byzantine high command fundamentally misread a massive geopolitical shift occurring on the Arabian Peninsula. Driven by the ideological cohesion of early Islam, a new, highly unified political and military entity emerged, the Rashidun Caliphate. When Arab forces began pushing rapidly into the Levant in the early 630s AD, the authorities in Constantinople initially dismissed the incursions. Rooted in centuries of classical Mediterranean prejudice, Byzantine officials viewed the Arab tribes merely as disorganized, nomadic raiders seeking temporary plunder. They entirely failed to recognize them as a disciplined, expansionist state apparatus, executing a highly coordinated invasion. As the Rashidun forces systematically captured key Levantine cities, including Damascus, Emperor Heraclius realized the severity of the strategic collapse. Operating from his forward base in Antioch, he ordered a massive imperial mobilization. He drained the remaining provincial treasuries and levied troops from across the surviving empire, assembling a colossal coalition force estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 men. Commanded jointly by the Armenian general Vahan and the emperor's brother Theodore, this army was a vast, multi-ethnic war machine. It consisted of heavily armored Greek infantry, Armenian heavy cavalry, Slavic auxiliaries, and allied Ghassanid light horsemen. Their operational objective was definitive. They were to march south, trap the Arab army, and crush them in a single, decisive, pitched battle to permanently restore Roman authority in Syria. To meet the enemy, the imperial army advanced into the rugged, undulating terrain of the Yarmouk River Valley. The oppressive, baking heat of the Syrian summer radiated off the black volcanic basalt of the Golan Heights, punishing the heavily armored Byzantine infantrymen as they trudged toward the frontier. Despite the stifling temperature and the severe logistical strain of moving tens of thousands of men and horses through the arid landscape, the Roman command remained supremely confident. They possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and relied on the traditional Mediterranean doctrine of the heavy infantry phalanx to dictate the terms of engagement. However, this massive coalition was internally fractured, plagued by language barriers, theological disputes, and growing logistical friction between the different ethnic contingents. Opposing this lumbering imperial juggernaut was Khalid ibn al-Walid, the supreme military commander of the Rashidun forces and one of the most brilliant cavalry tacticians in military history. Khalid commanded a much smaller force of roughly 20,000 to 40,000 men, but his army possessed absolute ideological unity and unparalleled strategic mobility. Recognizing the sheer kinetic weight of the approaching Byzantine heavy infantry, Khalid deliberately abandoned the captured cities of the north and consolidated his forces near the Yarmouk gorges. He selected this specific ground not to hold a static defensive line, but to leverage the complex, treacherous ravines as an environmental weapon against his numerically superior foe. The Yarmouk Plateau was bordered on three sides by deep, nearly impassable ravines, most notably the steep, rocky gorge of the Wadi al-Rukad to the west. By anchoring his position near these sheer drops, Khalid ensured that the battle would be fought in a defined geographical box. Khalid understood that the vast Byzantine numbers would be constrained by the steep river valleys, preventing them from extending their lines to flank his smaller army. Furthermore, he fundamentally restructured his forces to counter Roman tactical rigidity. He organized a highly disciplined mobile cavalry reserve, designed specifically to operate behind his main infantry lines. This swift reaction force was built to rapidly plug any breaches in the Arab defense or instantly exploit any structural failures in the Byzantine advance. The Roman commanders formed their massive, impenetrable shield walls, expecting a straightforward infantry clash, but Khalid had prepared a psychological and geographical trap they could not foresee. The engagement at Yarmouk was not a swift, single-day collision. It was a grueling, multi-day war of attrition that tested the absolute physical and logistical limits of both armies. For the first 5 days, Vahan utilized the immense numerical weight of his coalition, launching highly coordinated frontal assaults designed to systematically drive the Rashidun forces backward toward the steep, impassable ravines of the plateau. The Byzantine heavy infantry, forming dense, overlapping shield walls, ground their way forward across the sun-baked terrain. Their tactical objective was straightforward: exert unbearable frontal pressure across the entire line until the Arab formations simply fractured under the sheer mass of Roman bronze and iron. It was an application of classical, heavy infantry doctrine, relying on discipline, forward momentum, and the protection of armored ranks. However, Khalid ibn al-Walid countered this relentless mechanical pressure with fluid, centralized command. He had structured a specialized reserve force known as the Mobile Guard, an elite unit of battle-hardened cavalry that answered solely to his direct orders. Whenever the Byzantine infantry pushed a sector of the Rashidun line to the absolute breaking point, Khalid personally led this mobile reserve into the fray. Striking with surgical precision at the overextended Roman formations, the Arab cavalry consistently shattered the Byzantine momentum, forcing the exhausted imperial troops to fall back to their starting positions by nightfall. It was a paralyzing, bloody pendulum of advance and retreat that rapidly depleted the stamina of the heavily armored infantry while preserving the integrity of the Arab defensive box. By the dawn of the sixth day, the physical toll of the sustained combat had severely degraded the operational cohesion of the Byzantine coalition. Tensions between the Greek commanders and their Armenian and Arab Christian auxiliaries threatened to unravel the army's internal hierarchy. It was at this precise moment of command fragility that the environment fundamentally altered the geometry of the battlefield. The skies rapidly darkened as a sudden, violent Khamsin, a massive, seasonal desert sandstorm blowing out of the Arabian Peninsula, swept violently across the Yarmouk Valley. The weather instantly became the primary combatant, and it favored the army accustomed to its harsh realities. The gale-force winds blew directly from the south, driving a suffocating wall of hot, coarse sand straight into the faces of the advancing Byzantine formations. The stinging, blinding impact of the dust severely compromised Roman vision and choked the lungs of men already exhausted by days of heavy fighting. Crucially, the howling roar of the wind rendered the shouted orders of Byzantine officers and the blare of command trumpets entirely inaudible, instantly dissolving the strict unit cohesion required to maneuver a heavy infantry square. Furthermore, the blinding conditions completely neutralized the Byzantine archers, stripping Vahan of his primary ranged deterrent and his ability to suppress enemy maneuvers. While the imperial army instinctively hunkered down into rigid defensive postures to weather the environmental anomaly, Khalid recognized the Khamsin not as a hazard, but as the ultimate tactical cloak. He understood that the Byzantine heavy infantry, now blinded, deafened, and completely disorganized, was practically immobilized. Seizing the operational initiative, the Rashidun commander completely abandoned his defensive strategy and executed a massive, coordinated offensive. He did not waste his momentum by throwing troops against the static Roman infantry shields. Instead, he massed his entire cavalry force, uniting the mobile guard with his flanking squadrons into a single, overwhelming strike force. Khalid directed this concentrated cavalry hammer specifically against the Byzantine heavy horse stationed on the Roman flanks. In the doctrine of the late Roman military, cavalry was the essential instrument for screening the infantry and maintaining the integrity of a wide battle line. The imperial cavalrymen, blinded by the driving sand and struggling to maintain their own formations in the chaotic, low-visibility environment, were caught entirely off guard. The highly coordinated shock of the Rashidun charge shattered the Byzantine wings. Unable to effectively counterattack or communicate orders through the storm, the Roman horsemen broke completely. They were driven entirely off the Yarmouk plateau, fleeing northward to save themselves and permanently severing their tactical connection to the infantry they were deployed to protect. The flight of the cavalry effectively sealed the fate of the imperial field army. In ancient and medieval warfare, heavy infantry stripped of its cavalry screen is fundamentally defenseless against a highly mobile enemy. The vast squares of Byzantine foot soldiers were suddenly transformed from an impenetrable offensive juggernaut into isolated, static targets. They were stranded in the center of the plateau, blinded by the ongoing sandstorm and completely surrounded by Rashidun forces who could now strike from the dust and retreat at will, entirely unthreatened by Roman pursuit. Recognizing that their flanks had evaporated and that the offensive had collapsed, the imperial officers ordered a desperate general retreat. Abandoned by their cavalry and blinded by the storm, the massive Byzantine infantry squares began to fall back toward the only bridge that could save them, unaware that Khalid had already taken it. The retreat toward the bridge at Ain al-Dakkar was the final, fatal miscalculation of the Byzantine command, born entirely of geographical ignorance and severed intelligence. Khalid ibn al-Walid had not merely reacted to the blinding weather. He had orchestrated the entire engagement around this specific topographical choke point. The night before the decisive cavalry strike, the Rashidun commander had dispatched a swift, specialized detachment of horsemen behind the imperial lines to seize the stone crossing at Ain al-Dakkar. This bridge represented the sole logistical artery spanning the Wadi al-Rukad, a deep, treacherous ravine that formed the western boundary of the Yarmouk plateau. By quietly securing this crossing, Khalid finalized the geometry of his trap. He established the ultimate hammer and anvil. His united cavalry would serve as the highly mobile hammer, driving the blinded Roman masses directly into the impassable basalt gorges. Ignorant of this strategic decapitation, the massive Byzantine infantry squares executed a desperate fighting withdrawal through the howling Khamsin. Deprived of their cavalry screen and unable to see more than a few yards ahead, the Roman officers relied on strict physical discipline, ordering their men to lock shields and march westward based purely on memory and the natural downward slope of the terrain. Moving tens of thousands of heavily armored men under normal conditions is a monumental logistical task. Doing so in a blinding sandstorm, while under continuous harassment from Arab light skirmishers, degraded the imperial formations. The strict ranks dissolved from highly organized cohorts into a dense, lumbering herd, operating on the singular instinct to cross the river and reach the safety of the imperial supply depots. When the vanguard of the Byzantine retreat finally stumbled out of the dust and reached the coordinates of Ain al-Dakkar, they did not find an open road to safety. Instead, they crashed directly into the locked shields and leveled spears of the Rashidun holding force. The sudden, paralyzing realization that their sole avenue of escape was firmly in enemy hands violently fractured the remaining Roman command structure. General Vahan, desperately attempting to maintain order in the blinding grit, found it physically impossible to deploy his infantry for a counterattack. The tight, converging geography of the river valley compressed his massive numerical advantage into a narrow funnel, completely stripping the Byzantine heavy infantry of the physical space required to maneuver, extend their lines, or leverage their tactical weight. Sensing the sudden stagnation of the Byzantine withdrawal, Khalid ibn al-Walid committed his united cavalry force for the decisive blow. The Rashidun horsemen charged out of the dust, striking the exposed rear and flanks of the immobilized Roman squares. The kinetic impact was devastating. Unable to move forward across the blocked bridge, and unable to fight back effectively against the highly mobile Arab cavalry, the dense masses of imperial infantry were systematically driven backward. The pressure of the assault physically pushed the Byzantine lines off the established paths, forcing them toward the jagged, unstable precipices of the Wadi al-Rukad. The final phase of the Battle of Yarmouk was not a contest of martial skill, but a brutal exercise in physics and gravity. As the Rashidun cavalry relentlessly pressed the front lines, the sheer kinetic weight of terrified, armored men desperately backing away from the Arab swords forced the rear ranks directly over the edge of the ravines. The steep basalt cliffs offered no purchase for the heavy infantrymen. The valley echoed with the sickening rhythmic crunch of heavy bronze and iron armor striking jagged rock, followed by the dull snap of breaking bone as thousands of Byzantine soldiers plummeted hundreds of feet to the canyon floor below. The strict discipline that had defined Roman warfare for centuries became the instrument of their execution. As men tightly packed in standard formation inadvertently dragged their comrades down with them into the abyss, the imperial coalition completely disintegrated in the bottleneck. The unified command apparatus evaporated, and the engagement devolved into a unilateral destruction of Roman military assets. General Vahan, the supreme commander of the expedition, perished in the rout, either crushed in the panicked stampede or cut down by pursuing Rashidun riders as he attempted to extract his staff from the geographical snare. By the time the engagement concluded, the vast Byzantine field army, an estimated 40,000 to 80,000 men, had been systematically erased from the map. It was a complete operational failure, dismantled by a commander who perfectly understood how to weaponize weather and topography against an inflexible military doctrine. When the sandstorm finally cleared, Emperor Heraclius received word of the slaughter, and he knew instantly that the map of the world had been violently redrawn. The slaughter at the Wadi al-Rukad was not merely the end of a single military campaign. It marked the definitive conclusion of Roman antiquity in the East. Following the catastrophic loss of his coalition army at Yarmouk, Emperor Heraclius possessed no remaining strategic reserves to mount a viable counteroffensive. Without a centralized field army to garrison the vital frontier cities, the Byzantine administration was forced to systematically abandon Syria, Palestine, and shortly thereafter, the immensely wealthy province of Egypt, to the rapidly expanding Rashidun Caliphate. The geopolitical map was permanently fractured. The loss of Egypt's vast agricultural yields and tax revenues critically crippled the imperial treasury. The Roman Empire, once a colossal Mediterranean superpower that had spanned 3 continents, was irreversibly transformed into a medieval, Anatolia-based state, forced into a permanent defensive posture behind the Taurus Mountains for centuries to come. Across 700 years of military history, the Imperial High Command repeatedly failed to internalize the lethal lessons dictated by the Eastern frontier. From the expansionist era of the late Republic to the desperate struggles of late antiquity, Roman commanders consistently marched their peerless heavy infantry into environments that fundamentally neutralized their core tactical advantages. At Carrhae in 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus allowed political vanity to override basic logistical doctrine, ignoring secure mountain routes to march his static infantry squares directly into the inexhaustible, highly mobile archery train of the Parthians. 3 centuries later, at Edessa in 260 AD, Emperor Valerian drove a diseased and dehydrated army into a geographic snare, suffering the unprecedented, systemic humiliation of being captured alive by a Sassanid monarch who understood perfectly how to weaponize the arid plains. Finally, at Yarmouk in 636 AD, the sheer numerical mass of the Byzantine coalition was expertly dismantled by Khalid ibn al-Walid, who utilized blinding desert weather and treacherous ravines to sever the Roman cavalry from its infantry corps. In every instance, the architects of these monumental disasters suffered from a fatal combination of command arrogance and severe logistical overreach. They operated under the institutional assumption that the disciplined, forward momentum of Mediterranean heavy infantry could overcome any geographic or climatic disadvantage. Instead, they encountered highly adaptable, mobile adversaries who fundamentally refused to engage on traditional Roman terms. The Parthians, the Sassanid Persians, and the early Islamic armies did not attempt to shatter the locked Roman shield walls with brute frontal force. They utilized the harsh terrain, the absence of secure water sources, and the vast open expanses of the desert to isolate, exhaust, and ultimately break the rigid Roman command structure from the outside in. The heavy infantry of Rome successfully conquered the dense forests of Gaul, the freezing mountain passes of the Balkans, and the temperate coastal plains of the Mediterranean basin. They forged a military apparatus that defined the political order of the Western world for a millennium. Yet the arid wastelands of the East remained the ultimate unconquered equalizer. The desert proved to be a merciless theater where rigid tactical doctrine became a death sentence, and where the absolute limits of imperial power were repeatedly and violently drawn in the sand. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together, and join us as we continue to explore the battlefields that shaped the world.